It's Get Out of Here. I'm Warren Levinson.
The Seine, when she starts on her travels, lazily flows from her source. Slowly her length she unravels, twisting and turning her course. Deep in the country she'll tarry, not knowing which way to go, till the enchantment of Paris beckons her swiftly to flow.
Bing Crosby's interpretation of the Guy Lafarge song The River Seine gets this week's trip started. It's about Elaine Sciolino's long love affair with the river that runs through Paris. Sciolino's a longtime Paris correspondent. She's a contributing writer at the New York Times and its former Paris bureau chief. Her new book on the subject, The Seine, the River That Made Paris, is a loving look at the river's history and hydrology, from its source in Burgundy through the capital and on to the Atlantic at Havre. It's a book in which Elaine Sciolino manages to be both hard-nosed reporter and hopeless romantic, spending time on the architectural confections, the bridges that span the Seine, and the river brigade of the Paris police. In 1978, she writes, "I was seduced by a river." You actually grew up with a pretty good river to start with, the Niagara. So what is so much greater about the Seine?
The Niagara, Warren, is not really a river. It's a strait, and it's very short. We think of the Niagara and mostly think about Niagara Falls. The river is this swirly, curvy, very short length of water that I could see as a child from our living room window on the west side of Buffalo, New York. The Seine, on the other hand, is the river of France. It's the national river. It was defined that way by Napoleon, and it resolves loneliness. It inspires writers and artists. It attracts millions of tourists every year, and it makes me happy.
And how does it do that? I mean, and in Paris itself, the Seine in Paris, it's very much a man-made object. I mean, it's rechanneled, it's dredged, it's almost a canal.
Let's not call it a canal, but we'll call it a beautifully architecturally glorious invention. It is man-made, and it was, as you said, channeled and straightened because it's very curvy, in most of its 777 kilometer, almost 500-mile length. But in Paris, it's almost straight because it is banked by stone banks on each side.
The stone banks are really what make it this very romantic thing. So tell me about what the Seine means to you in terms of what it does to lift your spirits when you need that done.
You can't be unhappy along the Seine, even if it's raining, because there is a feeling of intimacy with the water. The river is so close to the bridges. There are 35 bridges over a span that's probably about 8 miles long in Paris. And you can, when you're on one of these bridges, you feel like you can almost touch the water. And then if you look on either side of the river, you see these extraordinary architectural jewels, whether it's the Louvre or the Institut de France or the Paris Mint, and they are reflected in the water, and you almost feel one with the water. And even yesterday, I was out there, and there's a flood right now in the Seine, and the water is churning, and it's this kind of khaki tan color, and it's moving in the wrong direction, but you feel its power, and you feel that you belong.
Let's talk about some of those bridges, because I am amazed by the bridges over the Seine in Paris, that it's as if somebody put up something in most of those cases to be a beautiful piece of art, not just to get you from one side of the river to the other.
Well, that's absolutely right. And if you know Paris at all, you will know various bridges. I mean, one of my favorite bridges is one that's not very special to look at, except it's a vehicle to into magic before dawn. It's the Pont de la Tournelle. It's so special because when you arrive there and watch the sun come up, the sun shines on the back of Notre Dame in bright orange, and you feel one with Notre Dame. There are other very beautiful bridges that have been in so many movies. The Alexandre III bridge, the Alexandre III, which is a Belle Epoque bridge with extraordinary animals and shells and sea monsters and globular chandeliers, and you feel as if you're at the turn of the 20th century Paris. So each bridge has its own identity.
It's also something that, of course, has inspired artists throughout the centuries and songwriters. You have a whole section on songs inspired by the Seine. Can you walk us through some of that?
I hadn't started out thinking I was going to write a chapter on songs of the Seine, but a young woman who was doing some research with me did a recording. She did a CD. She burned a CD with all of these songs of the Seine. And so every time I had a kind of writer's block, I played it and I said to myself, gosh, this is absolutely fascinating. I have to write about this phenomenon that there are over 100 songs just about the Seine River and sung by even American songwriters, from Bing Crosby to Dean Martin to Doris Day. And not an American group, but a European group, ABBA. So it's really fun to listen to all these wonderful songs about love and longing and death and destruction and heartbreak and survival.
I can still recall.
The Seine, like many rivers, has gone through periods of, for much of the rise of industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries, where it got to be, kind of a very dirty. And, to this day, it's not obviously the cleanest water. What is the situation now in terms of the cleanliness of the Seine?
You're absolutely right, Warren, in saying that for a long, long time, for centuries, it was very dirty, and even centuries ago, very smelly, because everybody threw their trash into the Seine. But depending on where you are along this river, it's a very long river, and it starts out as just a tiny little springs bubbling up from nowhere. Depending where you are, it can be extremely clean. At the source of the Seine, for example, which is in deep Burgundy, not too far from Dijon, I drank the water of the Seine from these very, very pure spring. In a few dozen miles west, as I was moving towards Paris, I went swimming in the Seine because it was cold. It was really cold. It was almost as cold as Lake Erie in June, but it was really fun to go swimming in this very clear water. It's only when the river gets urbanized and is too populated, either by people who live on boats in the river or boats that are ferrying goods along the river, or you have runoff from the rain in the cities, that it becomes very polluted. Now, on the other hand, there has been a move to clean up the Seine, and the current Mayor Hidalgo, is determined to have the Seine swimmable by 2024 for the Summer Olympics in Paris.
There was a whole, in order to draw the Olympics or to hock up the promotion of the Olympics, there was a whole event on the river with swimmers. Tell me about that.
Oh, that was a blast. She asked the French Olympic swim team to come and dive off a 12-meter diving board off the Alexandre III bridge into the Seine River. And I interviewed a few of the swimmers afterwards, and one of the swimmers said to me, well, it was kind of dark down there and kind of mucky when I hit the bottom, but I think if I have a good 20-minute shower, I'll live.
Yeah, well, actually, no worse than diving into the pool that was chemically treated wrongly in Rio de Janeiro.
Actually, it's interesting you mentioned that because one of the divers had been in the Olympics there, and that's exactly the point she made. She said, this is nothing compared to what I had to dive into in Rio.
I was so pleased that you have a whole section, a number of references to our friend Mort Rosenblum, the longtime Associated Press correspondent in Paris, who, my first trip to Paris, I was nobody at the AP. I managed to spend 40 years being pretty much nobody at the AP. But Mort generously took me out to lunch and just regaled me with stories of his career. And I don't remember any of them. I only remember his generosity in what he did. But to tell me, Mort lives on a houseboat now, right?
Well, Mort lives part of the year in a houseboat, then part of the year in his olive farm in the south of France, and then part of the year in Arizona. So he has a pretty multifaceted, rich life. So there is life after the Associated Press. But it's interesting you say that you met Mort when you were a nobody. I met Mort when I was a nobody. I had just arrived in Paris for the first time as a young foreign correspondent for Newsweek magazine, and Mort was the great Paris bureau chief of the Associated Press, and we were in the same building. The AP was one floor down from Newsweek, and Mort took me under his wing and extended the generosity of the bureau, and it was way back then that we became friends. And he wrote a brilliant book about his experiences on the Seine River about a generation ago.
It's Get Out of Here, the AP Travel Podcast. We're talking with Elaine Sciolino, who has written a book about the Seine called The River That Made Paris. We'll talk about the Seine outside Paris after a break. It's Get Out of Here, the AP Travel Podcast, talking with Elaine Sciolino, author of a new book about the Seine called The River That Made Paris. Let's talk about the Seine outside Paris. So the first thing you do, one of the first things you do is you go to the source of the Seine in Burgundy. It's just like a little tiny thing at that point, right?
Yes, you can't find it on any GPS. You really have to wander around the woods for a long time before you arrive there. And it just says sources of the Seine, Ville de Paris, city of Paris, because Napoleon III, when he was emperor, wanted to extend the power of Paris and elevate the Seine to greatness. So he just declared that the area that was the source of the Seine would become part of Paris. So Paris kind of has a 21st arrondissement. It's just about 150 some miles away from the border of Paris. However, it's a desolate area. It's kind of overgrown Gallo-Roman healing site because there was a healing temple and a healing goddess called Sequani who ruled over this land, and there's still a great story to be told there.
Well, tell me about Sequani.
Sequani is the Gallo-Roman feminist healing goddess, and people came from as far as what's now the English Channel and the Mediterranean to pray to her, to be healed. They put what they call ex votos, or offerings of body parts that needed to be healed into this basin so that she would hear their prayers. And they bathed in the basin. They stayed there for a weekend. It kind of was like a healing spa. And in the 18th century, the story of Sequani was rewritten by a novelist who made her a heroine, kind of like the Gallo-Roman heroine of the Me Too movement 2,000 years ago, because when she was playing on a beach one day along the sea, Neptune came rushing out of the water to grab her because he fell so madly in love with her and she was so beautiful. And she escaped his clutches by turning herself into the river Seine. And the word Seine comes from the word Sequani. so that she really does inspire the river even today.
Are there archaeological digs around the ancient temple?
There were a lot of archaeological digs around the ancient temple, and 1,500 of these ex votos, which are sort of carved body parts, either in stone or in wood or in metal, hammered out in metal, are in the Archaeological Museum in Dijon. There's an extraordinary bronze statue of Sequani in the Archaeological Museum in Dijon, and it's such a poor museum that it doesn't even have a gift shop. So you can't even buy Sequani statuettes or t-shirts or earrings or keychains. And so one of my great ideas in life is to market Sequani and make a lot of money for the museum.
Okay, so I mean, you actually made proposals for Sequana memorabilia, Sequana observation for making Sequana a bigger deal. Tell me about some of this and where it's gone so far.
I did. I actually put in a formal proposal to erect a statue of Sequana along the Seine River, the same size as the Statue of Liberty that is in the Seine River. I mean, why is there a 1/4 version of the Statue of Liberty sitting in the Seine River, and there's not Sequana? I mean, that you could even build the statue of Sequana next to the Statue of Liberty so that they could talk to each other. I proposed it. I put in a formal dossier, formal applications. When there was a contest to réinventer la Seine, to reinvent the Seine in the cities of Paris, Rouen, and Le Havre, I lost. But hope springs eternal, and if any of your listeners want to contribute to a fundraising for Sequana, the feminist Gallo-Roman healing goddess, they can contact you.
Okay. All right. There's challenge for Get Out of Here listeners.
Absolutely. Why not? Make Sequana famous.
Tell me something else. What else do you find in the Seine before the Seine reaches Paris?
Oh, before the Seine reaches Paris. Well, there's a small town called Châtillon where the Seine is about 1 foot wide. And you think to yourself, how in the world could this tiny little river suddenly become this grand river that powers itself to Paris and then all the way to the sea? And the reason is that along the way, the Seine picks up dozens of tributaries, and some of them are even more powerful than the Seine. And the rule of geography is supposed to be that if a bigger tributary hits a smaller tributary, the bigger one gets the name. But the name Seine was so powerful, and I think it's because of the ancient holy nature of the Seine, that the name Seine continued all the way to Paris and then to the sea.
And once the river gets past Paris, it goes through Rouen most famously. Does it have the same relationship with Rouen as it does with Paris?
It's really interesting. When you go to Rouen, they don't even think about Paris. The people of Rouen think that they are the center of the Seine universe, because if you look at history, many of the geographers that we Americans are familiar with started out in Rouen. Someone like, for your New York listeners, Verrazano. Verrazano started with 4 sailing ships in Rouen, and there's even a small mock-up, a quarter-sized replica of the sailing boat that made it to New York in Rouen. It's currently being rebuilt. LaSalle started his expeditions to the New World from Rouen. Robert Fulton. I mean, we think about Robert Fulton as
right, that steamboat guy.
Steam, exactly. But did you know that the world's first submarine was invented by Robert Fulton? And
I did not know until I read your book.
He put it into the Seine River in Rouen, and it was submerged for 17 minutes.
Got a great history. Huh?
It is very cool. It's got a great history in Rouen, but does it have the same kind of power over the city today?
It's very different because you don't have the same beauty of the river because of the architecture. You don't have the density of extraordinary architectural jewels on each side, and you don't have the density of bridges in Rouen that you have in Paris. So it's a very, very different feel.
And it's interesting, just overall, our history with rivers. Rivers were the source of life of many cities. Then, over the years, the rivers became polluted. They became dirty. They became places of crime, and cities turned away from rivers, especially with the rise of railroads. And now you have cities all over the world. I mean, New York is a good example. They're attempting to, and in many cases quite successfully, returning to rivers. But in a lot of ways, even as it got dirty, Paris never turned away from the Seine.
It's interesting because Paris, and even to a greater extent Rouen, have developed the riverfront. As you say, Warren, so many American rivers became places of danger and dirt and crime. And under this mayor and the mayor before of Paris, the berges of the Seine, the lower banks of the Seine, have been turned into places of recreation, so that you've got bicycle paths and jogging paths and restaurants and bars. And in the summer, you've got something called Paris Plage, Paris, the Paris beach, and part of the bank of the Seine turns into a beach. In Rouen, the entire riverfront has been reconstructed with all sorts of shops and restaurants, so that now the locus of attention and the magnetism comes from the banks of the river. The banks of the river are the place to be.
That is all great. I have to say, as a bicyclist, as far as I'm concerned, Mayor Hidalgo can do no wrong.
Especially during the strikes in Paris, which we had for weeks and weeks, the transit strikes. There were just too many people out there on bicycles, and they had never ridden a bicycle before, and they weren't wearing helmets. And that's kind of really weird if you're a pedestrian.
It can be a little strange, although, having ridden in a number of countries, in some, everybody wears a helmet. In Britain, pretty much everybody wears a helmet. In China, pretty much nobody wears a helmet. In Italy, if you're kitted out on a road bike, you wear a helmet. If not, you generally don't. So and in the Netherlands, nobody wears a helmet because cycling is considered so much a regular thing that they have reached a point where nobody considers it dangerous. Well, that's a whole other story. I could go on, and we won't.
I feel a way about bike helmets the way I feel about seat belts.
Oh yeah, my wife agrees with you. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, so we don't much have that conversation, but that's okay. Elaine Sciolino has written a wonderful book called The Seine, the River That Made Paris. She has been our guest on Get Out of Here. It was so nice to have you.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really fun, and I hope all of your listeners come and discover the Seine for themselves.
Elaine Sciolino is a contributing writer at the New York Times and its former Paris bureau chief. Her book, The Seine, the River That Made Paris, came out last year. The paperback version is due in October.
Elle recoule, coule, coule, ça comme plante dans la nuit. Elle roule, 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 vers la mer où tout finit. Elle chante, 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 chante l'amour de Paris, car la Seine est une amante. Et son amant, c'est Paris.
And now, my favorite trip. For Prabal Gurung, there's no place like home. The award-winning fashion designer was born 41 years ago in Singapore and raised in Nepal, but he's lived about half his life in New York City. He staged a recent fashion show at a Rockefeller Center landmark. Gurung told AP video producer Alicia Rancilio why he chose the Rainbow Room.
I wanted to bring everyone to Rainbow Room because I'm celebrating New York. It's misfits. It's brave, bold, audacious, hopeless, impossible dreamers. Who've come to this I would say, come to the city to find themselves, and in the celebration of the grit and the glamour that New York provides. It is also, I feel like it's one of those, the dichotomy of this city is really interesting to me because, the glamour of Uptown, the vibrance of Harlem to the, I would say, the gaudiness of, Times Square to the dark romance, beautiful romance and poetic romance of downtown East Village and Lower East Side and Brooklyn. I wanted to bring it all together because I feel like personally, I travel a lot across the world. I came from Nepal, New York has become my home in the last 20 years. And I think when I travel everywhere and I come back to New York, I feel like there's no place like this because it truly is a celebration of grit, and hard work. And I always say, you'll see a girl walking out of a gala in a ball gown and, running into a subway, picking up her ball gown, or there's a guy coming out of the car, just getting into a limousine. There's so many things within the few radius, of the avenues and the blocks. I feel like you see different characters. And I left Nepal 20 years ago to come here because I wanted to live my American dream.
Prabal Gurung's clients have included Michelle Obama and the Duchess of Cambridge, Kate Middleton. He spoke with the AP's Alicia Rancilio. And that's the show. Get Outta Here is a production of the Associated Press in partnership with Westwood One, produced under the supervision of Nikessa Moody and Peter Costanzo. I'm Warren Levinson. We'll see you next time.